Meet Gabriel Ramos, a promising but inexperienced archaeologist whose career has been plagued by skepticism from his peers. Known for his boldness in pursuing unorthodox discoveries, Gabriel often ventures into areas overlooked by the academic elite. His latest expedition took him and a group of close friends to a remote, abandoned village nestled deep in the Brazilian countryside. The village, shrouded in mist and whispers of forgotten rituals, has long been the subject of local superstition. Generations of villagers avoided the ruins, claiming that the earth holds what the living should not touch. The air in the village carried a strange, metallic tang, as if saturated with the breath of time itself. The group set up camp near the skeletal remains of what appeared to be an old chapel. Its walls, though crumbling, bore faded carvings of grotesque figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. In the center of the ruined altar was a large stone slab, half-buried and eerily warm to the touch despite the cold night air. Gabriel's instincts told him they were on the cusp of something extraordinary, or something dreadful. As the excavation began, unease settled over the group. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long under the dimming sun, and the forest surrounding the village echoed with faint, unintelligible murmurs. It wasn't just the sound of the wind, it was something deeper, something alive. Gabriel dismissed it as paranoia, pushing his friends to continue digging. But then they unearthed the callus. The artifact was unlike anything they had seen before, a cup forged from a strange, blackened metal that shimmered like liquid under the faintest light. Intricate symbols were etched around its surface, resembling neither any known language nor mere decorative art. As Gabriel lifted the callus from the soil, a sudden, biting wind howled through the chapel, extinguishing their lanterns. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the earth beneath them rumbled. Small stones tumbled from the walls, and the faint whispers in the forest grew louder, as if a chorus of unseen voices had awakened. Gabriel clutched the callus tighter, feeling a faint vibration in his hands, as if the object itself was alive. His friends urged him to put it back, their voices trembling with fear. But Gabriel, consumed by both curiosity and pride, refused. Unbeknownst to them, the callus was far more than an archaeological find. It was a vessel, a silent witness to centuries of blood rituals and sacrifices made to appease whatever dark force it once contained. And now it had been disturbed. The first sign of its power came later that night. As they gathered around their campfire, laughter turned to uneasy silence when one of them, Clara, swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. "He's just watching," she whispered, her face pale. The others glanced nervously, but there was no one there. Yet the feeling of being observed lingered, pressing against them like an invisible weight. Gabriel dismissed the incident as exhaustion, but even he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. When he finally turned in for the night, the callus sat on a makeshift table in his tent, its dark surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. As sleep took him, Gabriel dreamed of the chapel. Only this time it was whole, its walls pulsing with veins of molten light, and its altar slick with something that smelled of iron and decay. In the center stood the callus, overflowing with a crimson liquid that rippled as if alive. From the shadows emerged figures with hollow eyes and stretched smiles, the same grotesque beings from the chapel's carvings. They circled Gabriel, whispering in an incomprehensible language, their voices like nails scraping across his skull. One stepped forward, extending a hand toward him. Its skin was translucent, revealing veins that pulsed black with every word it spoke. Gabriel wanted to scream, but found his voice trapped in his throat. The being's finger pointed at the callus, then at him, before everything plunged into darkness. Gabriel awoke in a cold sweat, the whispering from his dream still echoing faintly in his ears. But the most chilling thing? The callus was no longer on the table. It was on the ground beside his bed, a faint red smear trailing from its rim. The first crack in his skepticism had formed, and with it, the door to something far darker was about to swing wide open. The night after unearthing the callus, Gabriel found it impossible to sleep. The events of the day churned in his mind, the eerie carvings, the unnatural wind, and the whispers that seemed to follow them. The others had retired to their tents, their nervous chatter dwindling into uneasy silence. Gabriel stayed awake, staring at the artifact resting on a crate near his bedroll. It seemed to glimmer faintly under the dim light of his lantern, a subtle, pulsing shimmer that felt more alive than mere metal should be. Finally, exhaustion overcame him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. It began with the sound of dripping, slow, deliberate drops echoing in the dark. Gabriel stood in a cavernous room, its walls slick with moisture and lined with symbols he couldn't recognize. The air was thick, almost suffocating, carrying a coppery tang that made his stomach churn. At the center of the room was the callus, now overflowing with a viscous, crimson liquid that glowed faintly. The dripping sound grew louder as Gabriel approached. Each step felt heavier, as though unseen hands clutched at his ankles. Shadows danced along the walls, forming grotesque shapes, twisted faces, clawed hands, and writhing bodies. They moved as if alive, their hollow eyes following his every movement. Despite the terror clawing at his chest, Gabriel couldn't stop walking. Something compelled him forward, an invisible force urging him closer to the callus. When he reached the altar, the air shifted. The dripping stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural hum that reverberated through his chest. Gabriel hesitated, but before he could step back, the shadows erupted from the walls, forming a circle around him. They whispered in unison, their voices a blend of languages he didn't understand. The sound burrowed into his mind, scratching at the edges of his sanity. Gabriel's breath quickened as the shadows leaned closer. One of them, a towering figure with elongated limbs and a face stretched into an eternal scream, stepped forward. It extended a hand, its fingers impossibly long and ending in razor-sharp claws. The callus began to tremble, the liquid inside rippling violently. Gabriel's feet refused to move, rooted to the ground as the figure's clawed hand reached for him. Then, the liquid in the callus began to rise. It defied gravity, twisting and coiling upward like a living thing. As it ascended, it took on a shape, a human-like form with hollow eyes and a mouth that oozed the same crimson liquid. The whispers grew louder, the words now clear but incomprehensible. The liquid figure pointed at Gabriel, its voice cutting through the cacophony like a knife. The sacrifice begins. Gabriel jolted awake, his heart pounding. His tent was dark, the lantern extinguished. He sat up, gasping for air, but the sound of dripping still echoed faintly in his ears. His hands shook as he reached for the lantern, fumbling to ignite it. When the flame flickered to life, his eyes darted to the crate where he had left the callus. It wasn't there. Panicked, he scanned the tent. The callus lay on the ground near his bedroll, tipped on its side. A dark, wet stain spread beneath it, glistening faintly in the lantern light. Gabriel's mind raced. Was it water? Sweat? Blood? The metallic smell from his dream still hung thick in the air, making him gag. The flap of his tent rustled suddenly, and Gabriel froze. A shadow passed outside, its outline distorted and wrong. He held his breath, waiting for it to pass, but the sound of whispering began, low and guttural, just outside the tent. Slowly, he reached for the lantern, extinguishing the flame. The darkness was suffocating, but it was better than being seen. The whispers grew louder, circling his tent like a predator stalking its prey. Gabriel clenched his fists, willing his breathing to steady. Then the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, so deep it pressed against his eardrums. And then the voice from his dream spoke, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from inside the tent. The sacrifice must begin. Gabriel's scream was muffled as the darkness closed in around him. Outside, the campfire flickered weakly, its light unable to reach the shadows now creeping through the village. The callus had begun its work, and Gabriel's nightmare was far from over. The next day dawned with an eerie stillness. The village, usually alive with the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds, was silent. Gabriel emerged from his tent, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't told the others about the events of the night, fearing they'd think he was losing his grip. But the callus was back on the crate, sitting exactly where he'd left it before falling asleep. The dark stain beneath it had dried into a crust, leaving behind a faint metallic scent that clung to the air like a warning. The group continued their exploration of the village, but unease hung heavy over them. Clara, still shaken from the figure she claimed to have seen the previous night, refused to leave Gabriel's side. Meanwhile, Paolo, the group's skeptic, dismissed her fears as superstition, though even he seemed more irritable than usual. As they sifted through the ruins, Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows between the crumbled walls seemed to shift unnaturally, and every so often, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, quick, fleeting, and always gone when he turned his head. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group gathered around the fire for dinner. They tried to make light conversation, but their laughter was forced, brittle. Gabriel's gaze kept drifting back to the callus, now resting on the ground near the fire. Its blackened surface seemed to absorb the light, creating an unnatural void. No one had dared to touch it since Gabriel's discovery, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Then came the first sound, a low, guttural hum, faint but persistent. At first, they thought it was the wind, but it didn't fade or change direction. It grew louder, resonating deep in their chests. Clara froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others nodded, their faces pale. The hum was joined by faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. They weren't random, they followed a rhythm like a chant. Gabriel's stomach churned as he realized the voices sounded eerily similar to the ones from his dream. Paolo, trying to mask his own fear, stood abruptly. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice trembled. "I'll prove it." He walked toward the shadows beyond the firelight, his flashlight cutting through the dark. "Paolo, don't," Clara pleaded, but he ignored her. The group watched in tense silence as Paolo disappeared into the ruins. His flashlight beam flickered erratically, as if the darkness was swallowing it. For a moment, all they could hear was his footsteps crunching against the gravel. Then, the whispers grew louder, sharper, as if reacting to his presence. "Paolo!" Gabriel called out, his voice tight. There was no response. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow, as the hum intensified. Suddenly, Paolo's flashlight hit the ground with a clatter. A single, blood-curdling scream tore through the night, then silence. Gabriel grabbed his own flashlight, his heart pounding. The others begged him not to go, but he couldn't leave Paolo behind. As he stepped into the darkness, the air grew colder, thicker. His beam swept across the ruins, catching glimpses of jagged stone and creeping vines, but no sign of Paolo. The whispers surrounded him now, rising to a deafening crescendo. He found the flashlight lying in the dirt, its beam flickering weakly. There was no sign of Paolo, no footprints, no blood, nothing. Gabriel's hand trembled as he picked up the flashlight, but as he turned, he froze. Standing at the edge of the light was a figure. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its hollow eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at Gabriel. "Leave the callus," it rasped, its voice layered with echoes. "Or suffer." Gabriel stumbled back, his chest tightening with panic. The figure didn't move but seemed to grow larger, its presence pressing against him like an invisible weight. He bolted, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fled back to the camp. When he reached the fire, the others were huddled together, their faces pale with terror. Gabriel didn't need to say anything. They already knew something was horribly wrong. The callus sat untouched, its dark surface now emitting a faint, pulsating glow. What is this thing?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Gabriel couldn't answer. All he knew was that the callus wasn't just an artifact. It was a beacon, a doorway, something far older and far darker than any of them could comprehend. And it wasn't going to let them leave. The whispers continued through the night, growing louder with every passing hour. Sleep was impossible. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the air seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. By morning, one thing was clear. Whatever they had disturbed wasn't finished with them. The callus had chosen them, and it demanded something in return. The second night was worse. The tension within the group had reached a breaking point, and the oppressive silence of the village seemed alive, crawling into their minds. Gabriel lay in his tent, his eyes fixed on the callus, which now sat on the crate once more. Its surface seemed to shift in the lantern's light, as though the blackened metal were breathing, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that mirrored a heartbeat. Exhausted but too afraid to sleep, he eventually succumbed to the weight of his eyelids. The dream began the same way, the sound of dripping, slow and deliberate, echoing in the dark. This time, Gabriel found himself in the same cavernous room, but it was no longer empty. The walls writhed with movement, shadowy figures twisting and clawing as if trying to escape the confines of the stone. The air was heavier now, suffused with the stench of rot and iron. In the center of the room stood the callus, glowing faintly with the crimson liquid that churned within. Gabriel tried to step back, but his body disobeyed. His feet dragged him forward, compelled by an unseen force. The whispers returned, growing louder with each step he took. They spoke in an ancient, guttural language, their cadence hypnotic and sinister. As he reached the callus, the figures on the walls began to take form, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were hollow, eyes empty voids that bore into his soul. One by one, they surrounded him, their twisted bodies exuding an otherworldly menace. The crimson liquid within the callus began to bubble, its surface breaking as something started to rise. Gabriel's breathing quickened as he realized what was happening. A hand, skeletal and dripping with the viscous liquid, emerged from the callus. It gripped the edge, pulling up a figure cloaked in shadow and blood. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes, two pinpoints of fiery red, locked onto Gabriel. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a guttural growl that vibrated through his chest. "You have awakened me," the figure rasped, its voice layered with echoes. "The sacrifice begins now." Gabriel tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure reached out, its hand elongating unnaturally as it grabbed his wrist. Pain shot through him like fire, and he screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive air. The entity's grip burned, leaving a blackened mark on his skin. The scene shifted violently. Gabriel found himself standing in the ruins of the chapel, but it was no longer crumbling. The walls were intact, pulsing with veins of molten light. The altar glistened with fresh blood, and the callus sat at its center, overflowing with the crimson liquid. Surrounding him were his friends, but they were not themselves. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes replaced by the same fiery red glow as the entity's. "Gabriel," Clara's voice called weakly, her mouth moving as blood dripped from her lips. "You did this." The entity's voice boomed, drowning out her plea. "Choose. Sacrifice one to save the others, or let them all fall." Gabriel's heart pounded as he looked at his friends. The entity stepped closer, its form growing larger, its shadow swallowing the room. "Time runs thin," it growled, extending its skeletal hand toward him. Gabriel awoke with a start, his chest heaving. His tent was dark, but the mark on his wrist burned, glowing faintly in the dim light. He scrambled to his feet, throwing open the tent flap. Outside, the campfire was dead, but the callus sat in the center of the circle, its faint glow illuminating the terrified faces of his friends. "What happened?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling. Gabriel couldn't speak. He could only stare at the callus, which now seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and shadows began to rise from the edges of the camp, twisting into grotesque shapes. One by one, they formed into the same hollow-eyed figures from Gabriel's dream, surrounding the group. Paolo screamed as one of the figures lunged, dragging him into the darkness. Clara grabbed Gabriel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to do something," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Gabriel's mind raced. The words of the entity echoed in his head, "Choose. Sacrifice one to save the others." Was it real? Was there a way to stop this? The shadows closed in, their whispers turning into guttural chants. Gabriel realized with chilling clarity that the nightmare had crossed into reality, and the callus demanded its price. As the figures loomed closer, Gabriel made a decision that would haunt him forever. He reached for the callus, its surface burning his hands, and screamed into the void. The chanting stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The shadows froze, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The entity's voice spoke again, low and menacing, "You cannot escape. The sacrifice must be made." Gabriel's vision blurred, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. The last thing he heard was Clara's scream, echoing in his mind as he fell into the void. The line between dreams and reality had shattered, and the nightmare was just beginning. Gabriel awoke to the sound of silence, so complete it felt deafening. His body ached, his palms still burning from where he had touched the callus. He was lying on the ground near the extinguished campfire, but the others were gone. The only thing left of his friends was Clara's scarf, tangled and torn, lying a few feet away. The callus remained in the same spot, but its glow had intensified, pulsating like a beating heart. Gabriel staggered to his feet, the weight of what he'd experienced pressing down on him. Were they dead? Taken? His memories were fragmented, pieces of a horrifying puzzle that refused to fit together. The whispers, the shadows, the entity, they all felt real, but logic clawed at his mind, begging him to believe it was a hallucination. Yet, the mark on his wrist remained, a charred reminder of the nightmare. Determined to find answers, Gabriel decided to revisit the chapel ruins. As he made his way through the dense fog that had enveloped the village, the air grew colder with every step. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and clawing at the sky. The whispers began again, faint but persistent, seeming to come from every direction. Gabriel's hands trembled as he clutched his flashlight, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. When he reached the chapel, it was no longer a ruin. The structure stood intact, its walls glowing faintly with an unearthly light. The carvings he had seen before were now vivid, almost alive. The grotesque figures seemed to move when he wasn't looking, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Gabriel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but the pull of the callus, and the need to know what had happened to his friends, dragged him forward. Inside, the altar was pristine, its surface slick with a dark, viscous liquid that trickled down to the floor in rhythmic drips. The callus was there, as if waiting for him, its glow synchronized with the ominous hum that filled the room. But something else caught Gabriel's attention, a mural painted on the far wall, hidden beneath layers of soot and decay. He approached it cautiously, the whispers growing louder as he wiped away the grime. The mural depicted scenes of blood rituals performed by hooded figures, each holding the callus. The sacrifices were horrific, with bodies splayed across altars and the liquid from the callus spilling over, forming shapes that looked eerily like the shadowed entity from his dreams. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat when he saw the final panel of the mural. It showed a man standing alone, surrounded by the hollow-eyed figures. The man held the callus in his hands, his face twisted in agony. But it wasn't just the scene that chilled Gabriel to the core, it was the man's face. It was his face. A sudden, piercing scream echoed through the chapel, jerking Gabriel out of his stupor. It was Clara's voice. Without thinking, he turned and ran toward the sound, his flashlight flickering wildly. The scream led him to an underground passage, hidden behind the altar. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were damp and covered in claw marks, as if something had been desperately trying to escape. The tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, and Gabriel froze at the sight before him. Clara was there, suspended in midair by tendrils of shadow that pulsed and writhed like living things. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips moving in silent pleas. The entity from his dream loomed over her, its form more defined now, an amalgamation of twisted limbs, hollow eyes, and a gaping mouth that oozed darkness. "You have disturbed the balance," it growled, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "The callus demands payment." Gabriel's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The whispers grew deafening, and the room seemed to close in around him. The entity extended a hand toward him, its claws dripping with the same crimson liquid that filled the callus. "Choose," it commanded. "One life to restore order, or all shall perish." Gabriel's legs trembled, his knees threatening to give way. Clara's tear-streaked face locked onto his, silently begging for his help. But the shadows behind her began to move, revealing the forms of Paolo and the others, their bodies contorted and lifeless, their eyes replaced by glowing red embers. This wasn't just a choice, it was a punishment. Gabriel realized with dawning horror that the callus wasn't just a relic, it was a gateway, a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. It had bound itself to him, forcing him into a game where the stakes were life and death. Summoning every ounce of courage, Gabriel stepped forward. "Take me," he whispered, his voice breaking. The entity paused, its head tilting as if considering his offer. Then it let out a low, guttural laugh. "You are already mine," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But the callus hungers for more." Before Gabriel could react, the tendrils of shadow engulfed Clara, pulling her into the darkness. Her scream echoed one last time before it was abruptly silenced. The cavern shook violently, and the entity began to dissolve, its form unraveling into the shadows. The callus appeared in Gabriel's hands, its surface burning like fire, its glow brighter than ever. Gabriel fell to his knees, clutching the cursed artifact as the chamber collapsed around him. When the dust settled, he found himself back in the ruined chapel alone. The callus sat on the altar, cold and lifeless, but the mark on his wrist continued to burn. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was far worse. Gabriel knew the truth now. The callus wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a curse that could never be undone. And he was its new keeper. Gabriel stumbled out of the chapel, the callus heavy in his hands, as if its weight were more than just physical. The silence of the village was now unbearable, a suffocating void that pressed against his ears. His friends were gone. The memories of their final moments haunted him, replaying in vivid, agonizing detail. Clara's screams, Paolo's disappearance, and the shadows that seemed to devour their very existence. He clutched the callus tighter, his knuckles white, as if letting it go would unleash the entity once more. He didn't know where to go or what to do. The village, once a collection of decrepit ruins, now seemed alive, pulsing with an unseen energy that made every step heavier, every breath harder. The mist that blanketed the area thickened, swirling unnaturally around him, whispering faintly as it brushed against his skin. The whispers were no longer faint echoes in the distance. They were here, surrounding him, speaking directly into his mind. "Gabriel," they called, each syllable dragging like a claw across his sanity. "You cannot escape. The callus is yours now. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Gabriel decided to find someone, anyone, who could help. He remembered the historian he had met weeks earlier, a recluse who specialized in occult artifacts and obscure folklore. Gabriel set off toward the nearby town, his steps faltering as the whispers followed him, never ceasing. Hours passed as he trekked through the forest, but the path twisted unnaturally, leading him in circles. Landmarks he had passed earlier appeared again, though slightly altered, as if the forest itself were shifting around him. The trees seemed to move when he wasn't looking, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Exhausted and disoriented, Gabriel realized with growing dread that he was trapped. The whispers grew louder, and the forest darkened, even though it should have been midday. Gabriel's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced in the corners of his vision. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a tree, when he saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was a woman, her face obscured by the mist, wearing a tattered cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows around her. Gabriel called out, his voice hoarse, but she didn't move. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward a narrow, overgrown trail that he hadn't noticed before. "Who are you?" Gabriel demanded, his voice trembling. But the woman didn't answer. She turned and began walking down the trail, disappearing into the mist. Gabriel hesitated, his instincts screaming to turn back, but the pull of the callus was undeniable. He had no choice but to follow. The trail led to a clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood, its roof sagging under the weight of time. The air here was colder, biting through Gabriel's clothes. The door creaked open as he approached, as though inviting him inside. Swallowing his fear, he stepped in. The interior was sparse, lit by a single flickering candle. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with books and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Sitting at a worn wooden table was an old man, his eyes sunken and his skin stretched tightly over his skull. He looked up as Gabriel entered, his gaze locking onto the callus. "So it has chosen you," the old man said, his voice a raspy whisper. Gabriel placed the callus on the table, his hands trembling. "What is this? What's happening to me?" The old man studied him for a moment before speaking. "The callus is not an artifact. It is a vessel, one created to contain something that should never have been disturbed. It binds itself to those who awaken it, feeding on their fears, their sacrifices. You are its keeper now, whether you wish to be or not." Gabriel's heart sank. "How do I stop this? How do I end it?" The old man shook his head slowly. "There is no end. Not for you. The callus will demand sacrifices, and if you refuse, it will take from you anyway. The only way to quiet it is to give it what it wants." Gabriel's mind reeled. He couldn't condemn another life to save his own, but the thought of resisting and losing everyone was unbearable. "There has to be another way," he pleaded. The old man's expression darkened. "There is a legend of one who defied the callus, who tried to destroy it. But the price was unimaginable. The shadows consumed him, and his soul was lost. Do you think you are strong enough to face such a fate?" Before Gabriel could respond, the candle flickered violently, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. The cabin trembled as shadows began to seep through the walls, their forms twisting and writhing. "They are here," the old man said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "You must leave. Now." Gabriel grabbed the callus, its surface burning his hands once more, and fled into the night. The whispers followed him, growing into guttural growls as the shadows pursued. The forest closed in around him, the path vanishing beneath his feet. He ran blindly, his lungs burning, until he tripped and fell onto the cold, damp ground. When he looked up, he was back in the village. The chapel loomed before him, its doors wide open, the pulsing glow of the callus emanating from within. Gabriel realized with sinking dread that there was no escape. The callus had brought him back, and the nightmare was far from over. Gabriel stood frozen before the chapel, its once ruined structure now fully intact, radiating an unnatural, pulsing light that spilled into the surrounding darkness. The callus in his hands grew heavier, its surface burning with an intensity that seared into his skin. The whispers had grown into a deafening roar, a chorus of voices speaking in an ancient, guttural language that pressed against his sanity. He wanted to run, to abandon this cursed place, but the callus seemed to pull him forward, dragging him toward the gaping entrance of the chapel like a predator guiding its prey. As he crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. The air inside was heavy, suffused with the stench of rot and iron. The chapel's walls were alive, veins of crimson light coursing through them like blood pumping through a monstrous heart. The carvings that once adorned the walls now writhed and shifted, grotesque faces twisting into expressions of agony and malice. At the center of the altar, the callus glowed brighter than ever, as though it were feeding on the very darkness around it. Gabriel approached, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast chamber. As he neared the altar, a voice broke through the cacophony of whispers, deep and resonant, vibrating through his very bones. "Welcome, Keeper," it said, the words dripping with malice. From the shadows behind the altar, the entity emerged. It was no longer a vague figure, but a fully formed monstrosity. Its body was a tangle of elongated limbs and gaping mouths, its hollow eyes burning with a fiery crimson light. The air around it shimmered with a palpable darkness, a void that seemed to devour the light of the callus. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat as the entity stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnatural, like smoke given form. It raised a clawed hand, pointing directly at him. "You have defied the balance," it growled, its voice layered with countless others. "Now you must choose." The words sent a shiver down Gabriel's spine. "Choose what?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The entity gestured, and the ground before the altar split open with a deafening crack. From the chasm rose figures, his friends. Paolo, Clara, and the others stood motionless, their eyes replaced by the same crimson glow that burned in the entity's gaze. Their bodies were twisted, marred by jagged scars and shadowy tendrils that coiled around them like chains. "They are bound to me now," the entity said, "but they are not beyond salvation. Offer the callus what it craves, and they will be freed. Refuse, and their torment will be eternal." Gabriel's mind raced. The callus craved sacrifice, but it was no ordinary life it demanded. It wanted him to choose. The weight of the decision crushed him. Sacrifice someone else to save his friends? Or refuse and condemn them all to suffering? The entity stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "Decide, Keeper," it hissed. "The balance must be restored." Gabriel's eyes darted between the callus, the entity, and his friends. His hands shook, the burning weight of the callus almost unbearable. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but the futility of his situation was clear. The entity was unstoppable, an ancient force bound to the callus, and he was nothing but a pawn in its game. Summoning what little courage he had left, Gabriel spoke. "If I offer myself, will it end?" The entity paused, tilting its grotesque head. "You cannot escape your role, Keeper. The callus is bound to you. Sacrifice yourself, and the cycle will continue. Sacrifice another, and the balance is restored for now." Gabriel's heart sank. There was no true escape, no way to destroy the callus or the entity it served. His choices were meaningless in the face of an eternal cycle of darkness and despair. Suddenly, Clara's voice broke through the oppressive silence. "Gabriel, please," she whispered, her tone filled with agony. "Don't let us suffer." Tears streamed down his face as he gripped the callus. The entity loomed over him, its clawed hand reaching out as if to guide his decision. The whispers grew louder, a deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter his mind. Gabriel raised the callus, its glow now blinding. "Take me," he screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. The entity froze, its hollow eyes narrowing. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the entity let out a guttural laugh, a sound that reverberated through the chapel like the toll of 1,000 funeral bells. "You are already mine," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But the callus craves more." Before Gabriel could react, the shadows surged forward, engulfing his friends. Their screams echoed through the chapel, piercing and desperate, before being abruptly silenced. The callus pulsed violently in his hands, its glow fading as the shadows receded. The entity stepped back, its form dissolving into the darkness. Gabriel fell to his knees, the callus now cold and lifeless in his hands. The chapel was silent once more, its walls crumbling back into ruins. The only evidence of what had transpired was the mark on Gabriel's wrist, now seared deeper into his flesh. The entity's voice echoed faintly as it disappeared. "The cycle begins again, Keeper. You cannot escape." Gabriel was alone, the weight of his decision crushing him. His friends were gone, the callus still bound to him. And deep in the shadows, the whispers began to stir once more. Gabriel wandered aimlessly through the ruins of the village, clutching the now cold callus. His body felt hollow, as though the life had been drained from him, leaving behind only the weight of guilt and despair. The silence around him was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, a constant reminder of the screams that had echoed through the chapel. The village had returned to its decayed state, but something felt wrong. The ruins weren't just abandoned, they felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent presence that lingered just beyond perception. He tried to recall the faces of his friends, but their features blurred in his mind, replaced by the haunting image of their hollow, glowing eyes as they were consumed by the shadows. The mark on his wrist throbbed, the charred edges still raw and painful, as if the callus itself was reminding him of its claim. Gabriel couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of wind carried faint voices calling his name. In the days that followed, Gabriel made his way back to civilization, though civilization felt alien to him now. The bustling streets of the nearby town were too loud, too bright, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness he had escaped. He tried to explain what had happened to the historian, but the man only shook his head, his eyes filled with pity. "You've brought it with you," he said. "It's part of you now." Gabriel spent his nights in a small motel on the outskirts of town, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the chapel, its glowing walls, and the monstrous entity that had claimed his friends. The callus sat on the table beside him, its surface dull yet somehow menacing, as if it were waiting. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, more insidious, seeping into his thoughts when he was at his weakest. One night, as he sat staring at the callus, he noticed something strange. The mark on his wrist glowed faintly in the dark, pulsating in time with his heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words for the first time. "Return to the altar," they said. "The cycle is not complete." Gabriel's heart raced. He wanted to throw the callus away, to abandon it in some forgotten corner of the world, but he knew it wouldn't let him go. It was bound to him, and he to it. Desperation clawed at his mind as he realized the truth. The callus wasn't done with him. Determined to find answers, Gabriel began researching the village's history. He combed through old archives, questioning locals who were reluctant to speak. The fragments of information he uncovered painted a chilling picture. The village had been cursed centuries ago, its inhabitants disappearing mysteriously after the callus was unearthed during a church renovation. Stories spoke of a keeper chosen by the artifact, forced to feed it sacrifices to prevent the awakening of an ancient evil. But no one had ever succeeded in escaping the callus grip. The keepers always vanished, consumed by the very shadows they sought to control. Gabriel's blood ran cold as he read the final line of an old journal entry written by the village's last priest. "The keeper is not the master. They are merely the first to fall." The more Gabriel learned, the more the callus seemed to respond. Its glow returned, faint but steady, and the whispers grew more demanding. Shadows in his room stretched unnaturally, forming grotesque shapes that lingered at the edges of his vision. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, pulling him back to the chapel night after night, forcing him to relive the moment his friends were taken. One morning, Gabriel woke to find the callus gone. Panic set in as he searched the room, but the artifact was nowhere to be found. Instead, a single phrase had been scratched into the wall above his bed: "You cannot escape." The words burned into his mind as he realized what the callus was doing. It was drawing him back to the village, to the chapel where it all began. He packed a bag and set off, driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need for closure. When he arrived, the village was unrecognizable. The ruins had vanished, replaced by an eerie, pristine version of the settlement. The chapel stood tall, its doors open, beckoning him inside. Gabriel hesitated, his breath catching as he felt the weight of countless eyes watching him from the shadows. Inside, the altar was as he remembered it, glowing with that same malevolent light. The callus sat at its center, pulsating faintly. But this time, there was something else, a figure, standing in the darkness beyond the altar. It was human-shaped but wrong, its edges blurred as though it didn't fully exist in this reality. "Welcome back, Keeper," the figure said, its voice layered with countless others. Gabriel stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes piercing through him. "It is not what I want," it replied. "It is what the callus demands. The cycle must continue." The ground beneath Gabriel's feet began to tremble, cracks spreading through the stone as shadows poured forth, writhing and twisting toward him. He reached for the callus, its surface burning his hands once more, but this time he didn't let go. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar as the shadows consumed him. The last thing he saw was the figure stepping closer, its hollow eyes filling his vision. And then silence. When the villagers returned to the chapel years later, they found nothing but ruins and a single artifact lying in the dirt, a blackened callus, cold and lifeless, waiting for the next keeper to awaken it. The whispers, however, never truly faded. They lingered in the air, calling to anyone who dared to listen. The cycle begins again,